why I got involved with this event. The first being, the book is steeped in deep research. I think you spoke to over 30 schools, and that resonates with Stellenbosch and our vision. And our vision is to be globally recognized as excellent, inclusive, and innovative, where we advance knowledge in service of society. The second reason speaks more to the business school itself and our mission. And if I read it a little bit, it says, through knowledge advancement and transformative learning, we develop responsible leaders who positively impact society. So in there is this notion of responsible leadership. And every single student that comes to the USB all leave with this understanding that business is not just about business and satisfying stakeholders. It's about broader society. It's about environment. So we sensitize and not necessarily change people to this notion of caring about the broader society. And this book today speaks to that notion of a broader society. The third reason, and my final reason, is I'm a parent. I live in the Western Cape. I've got two beautiful daughters. So this topic of schools and access to schools as a Black parent is very close to my heart. So that's the third reason why I wanted to get involved with this event. So I want to congratulate you, Prof. And Samantha, for a wonderful piece of work. Samantha, if I keep with the theme of threes, I look forward to number 2 and I look forward to number 3. Reddy, you as well. This is the first time that we work together, so I hope we're going to see a second time and at least a third time. And with that, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Thank you. To those who are joining us, we are having a conversation. It's not just about me posing the questions to Prof and Samantha. We want your input. We want you to share your experiences. We're not going to be able to address specifically, perhaps, a problem that you may raise pertaining to an experience at a particular school or so, but we are taking a broader view of these issues. We welcome your questions, your participation, and I'd be delighted to pose these to my panel just later on. Okay, I'm going to spend a few minutes just giving you my impressions of the book. It's not often that I see chapters of my life reflected in an academic inquiry. There isn't anything that was discussed, explored, researched in the school that I did not experience. But it's important to say, I had not thought deeply about some of the things I observed in my schooling career. I had not theorized about some of the practices, the cultures that I saw in my schools. Let me tell you what I mean. So I started school at St. John Bershman, a primary school in Orlando East in Soweto, a township school. And then one day the nuns at the school, it was a Catholic primary school, the nuns at the school called my mother in, who had just recently been widowed, and said, listen, you've got to get this child out of this school. You've got to take her to a multiracial school in the northern suburbs. So these were the teachers at the school who were doing their best, I still maintain, but they thought that what they were offering, what the school was offering, was not good enough for me. Of course, I was delighted that my teachers thought I was that clever. But when I read this book, I did see that experience in a different prism. It is the beginning of exclusion because they singled me out as deserving of a different environment. So what happens to those who were left at that school at St. John Bershman? The second chapter, my mother tried with her nurse's salary, took me to a private school, a convent in the northern suburbs of Johannesburg. Navigating the language barrier, the class issues and so on. We were the kids from Soweto who were going to school in a private school, a majority white private school in the northern suburb. This is what happened. The white kids started leaving when we arrived. But here's another thing. I remember this conversation. A fellow nurse, a mother at the school who was a nurse, her husband was a doctor. Now, when you were that couple in the township, a doctor and a nurse, you were a power couple. Their kids had been at the convent from grade, let's say preschool, kindergarten. So I want you to just see the distinction. We were the kids at 12 years old, coming from the township, coming to a private school. They were the Black kids who had been there since kindergarten. And this Black nurse said to my mother, another Black nurse, that she's taking her kids out of the convent because this year, meaning the year I arrived, they took on too many Black kids. I drive past that convent sometimes. It is now almost 100% Black. In fact, when I left 3 years after arriving, it was almost exclusively 100% Black, meaning in 3 years, the school had gone from being majority white to being majority Black. This is in 1990 to 1992, 1993. That's the second chapter of my schooling life. Here's the third one. Around 93, the former Model C school started opening up. My mother, single mom with a nurse's salary, she couldn't keep up the fees at a private school. And of course, it's not just the fees, it's transport money, lunch, and so on. She did her maths and she realized that if I went to a boarding school at a former Model C school, she could even pay less, but I'll be getting an education, I'll be getting food, I'll be getting boarding, and she'll be saving on the transport cost because we were going home once a month. So I went to Potchefstroom Girls High. This is where I think I thrived the most. Great teachers, absolutely wonderful. But I do remember some teachers saying things like, you know, how did you get so clever? And I think if you're South African, you know where that's going and what that means. But Potch remained, I think, the school that shaped most of what I started to think about, given that we were in beer land. There was a lot of racism in the community. The school treated us well and all of that. But I now know from reading this book that there were so many nuances, so many case studies that explain the South African story that we haven't even begun to communicate about, that we haven't even begun to understand. And so when I went to Potchefstroom Girls, remember, I'd been to a Parktown convent, so I was speaking like an educated Black, whatever you could perceive that to be. And then there were Black kids coming from the Ikageng township, whose experience of a multiracial environment started at Potch Girls. They were overwhelmed, they felt excluded, they felt their accents were wrong. The school environment was just unfamiliar for them and they had to navigate all of that. But how do we find each other as South Africans? How do we rise above the class differences to ensure that every single kid gets a chance for a quality education, to ensure that not just one kid gets chosen by the teacher to go to a better school? And what are these obstacles towards attaining that betterment for everybody else? So that's the story, and that's why the book resonated with me. With that, Prof and Samantha, you've got the floor. Thanks for joining me. Here's what I want to ask you. Why do we need to understand? I'll start with you, Samantha. Why do we need to understand who schools are admitting and leaving out? We've got schools all over, right? Kids go to school every single day. Why is it an issue to know who's coming in and who's being left out?
Well, firstly, really, that story, let me just say that the story you spoke about is so familiar to so many people and resonates with so many people. And that's precisely why the book is so important and the book needs to come out, because there are lots of parents who want their kids to go to what they think are much better schools. Yet when they get that letter saying, sorry, you've not been accepted, you're not in the zone, or for whatever reason, very often they don't give reasons, parents need to know, or they want to know, why was my child not accepted at the school? And schools kind of dot around that. They use zones, and in one of the epigraphs we've got that where it says zones are con, and they actually are. So for me, what has been important about this book and what is very useful is the fact that it gives insight into parents about how schools are how they exclude, who they take in, what is important to them. And yeah, that's it.
Mm-hmm. Prof, just though going through the exclusionary processes and admissions, towards the end at least, I got a sense that a lot of schools are oblivious to the obstacles that they put in the way of admissions. They think that their policies, the direct and indirect ones, because you make a distinction between the two, they think that these are reasonable, that there's no deliberate effort to exclude a Black child, a poor child, a child who doesn't come from the right social standing. They would deny, right, that there is that kind of exclusion.
That is correct, Reddy. I've recently used an expression that makes so much sense to me about privilege, and it's this: that a fish doesn't question the water it swims in, and when it is sort of your world, your everyday world, your assumptions about the world, when you've got to answer for everything, like why you don't take Black kids from outside the residential area because it's really not good for young children to be traveling for an hour from Milnerton to Rondebosch and that kind of nonsense. So when you begin to tell yourself stories about fairness that are so blatantly not fair, then you get to sustain the kind of system, this kind of inequality that we speak of. And that is why Sam and I, grateful as we were to all 30 principals and their staff for really opening up to us. We often sat in interviews. I remember one or two that are remarkable. And here you have two Black researchers, right? And the principal would tell you something that is so obviously discriminatory and not have a clue. And so you have to control as a researcher your body language. You've got to make sure you don't react. And I found that, I found it quite sad that so many of our compatriots, live in a bubble that is oblivious to the harshness, the hardness, of these inequalities when it comes to the experiences of parents who didn't get in.
I laughed when you were talking about someone making a comment that is so blatantly inappropriate and they're not even aware of it. I remember there was one estate agent who was talking about how the Muslims have taken over, that whole language of yes, combat and being attacked and so on.
Yeah.
At the same time, I do have some empathy for schools because it's almost as if we expected schools like Potchefstroom Girls, for example, that were exclusively white in 1993, in the midst of the apartheid edifice breaking down. There was violence in the streets. We were not hearing each other. The political negotiation and space was noisy. There were assassinations. You know what it was like in 1993. We almost left schools to their own devices and expected that they would just understand theoretically and in praxis how to manage the transformation project. I mean, it's overwhelming for all of us, but for schools, is that burdening the schools and expecting too much of the schools? What do you think, Samantha?
Well, 26 years later, we can't sit with the same problems. And that for me at this stage, you've got enough time to actually see what works, what can we do, what can we put in place, how can we get more teachers of color, how do we work around you've got to have an action plan. A lot of schools don't do that. They stick with what they know. They stick with who they know. They stick with outdated policies. They stick with outdated admission policies that's been there for ages. I mean, we had one incident where a school had kind of put us off all the time, and I strongly suspect it's because they kind of thought, oh my word, maybe we should update our admissions policy because there was obviously some holes in it. So, I don't think that it's an excuse.
Right, okay. Prof, I had a battle with my conscience when I was reading some chapters of the book and questioning myself about how much, as a Black, upwardly mobile professional, how much I'm contributing to the exclusion the exclusionary practices. Let me tell you what I mean. So when I moved from the township school to the private school, I went all over writing entrance, what do they call, aptitude exams. And I think my mom had applied at about 10 private schools around. I wasn't accepted at, only 2 accepted me. And every time we got a rejection letter, I don't know why it didn't break my spirit. It just didn't. I just felt that one day we'll succeed. I didn't know from reading, before I read the book, that on its own is an exclusionary tool. Here's where my conscience got the better of me. I've had, since living in the house that I'm living in, I've had relatives, former friends from Soweto, sending me WhatsApp asking if they can use my address or my utility bill to get their kids in the schools in the area. The last incident was about 3 weeks ago. So I'm reading this thing and I think, do I participate? Did I participate in that? Was it the right thing to do? This person is desperate to get their child to the school right around the corner from my house. That's the second bit. The third bit, my kids go to a private school. And you said things in that book that I did not even pause to reflect on. Social standing, the social selection. So Ridi Tlhabi is a talk show host. She gets invited to the school to give a speech, to do this, to do this. I didn't realize that also contributes to our entry, as it were. My husband is a doctor. I'm proud of him, but I didn't see that has anything to do with being the right kind of people to be at the school. How do we reconcile, our standing in life, where we are in life, wanting to contribute to the schools, but not using our privilege to normalize practices that seem positive, but are actually tools to keep others out?
Yeah, I thank you as usual for your honesty about these things, Reddy. We are complicit as the Black middle class, make no mistake. I include myself in that, in keeping the system going, and the book explains why. Having said that, it's very, very difficult. I had an amazing doctoral student who just finished a PhD, Chapisa Matenji from the East Rand, and she did her study on how Black middle-class parents in predominantly white schools try not to be too offensive, try not to ask too many questions, just in case your kid goes out. So they rock the boat, but stay in the boat. And I think that is true. Having said that, when it comes to people, if I may, really, like you and I, we do have a certain kind of standing in the community. We can push the school through the governing body to be more inclusive. We can. In other words, the risks are less for you and me than it might be for a first-generation parent out of Orlando who's like your mother, just trying to get my kid in, and so on. So I do think that those people with voice have to press the schools. And let me just say in this regard one thing. We make a mistake in thinking that opening up our schools is only about Black kids. What we have failed to do in the public sphere is persuade white parents, this is good for your kids. Your kids are not going to work in a world or live in a world, in which everybody look like them and pray like them and speak their language. So this is good for the country. It is good for white parents. Obviously, for Black parents, it is a very simple calculation. If I get one of my kids, my parents have made that calculation. If I get one of my kids to get to a good school or get a degree through a university, everything changes in the domestic economy. So that's why the stakes are so high. But underline this, it is good for all our children.
Mm-hmm. And Samantha, just on the tools as well, because I think it's very important that we do reflect on things that seem normal, but are actually perpetuating this particular system. So that whole idea around the culture of the school, whether you've had a sibling there before, the old girls politics, I never ever thought that is something to actually challenge in the school. But here's where I did have an aha moment in keeping with that theme, that heritage actually speaks to the politics of this country, because where is a first-generation Black person who goes to an elite school? Where's the heritage? Because I'm the first one in my family. So what seemed like just a nice, fun, colonial English tradition is actually ill-suited for the country in which we live.
That's right. a lot of schools have noticed that the heritage policy or the heritage privilege or alumni privilege has been taken off from lots of the admission forms that you would get on the website. However, going into schools, we found that as much as schools will say, well, that's not, we don't look at heritage, we don't look if your parents have been there, we found that it was extreme, it was covert. It was, they still used it because, listen, your alumni is going to give you money. If you look at how these schools kind of operate, there's money pumped into it. You look at these elite schools and there's a pavilion that is named after a famous person that was there. There's a sports field. There's a sports hall. So that's, the schools want to keep that. So very often that heritage privilege is there. In fact, we had one principal who said, no, we've done away from it. And you know, we're not getting any of, we're not using that privilege. But I mean, in the very next sentence, he was very proud of the fact that, you know, he's teaching out of 700 children in his school. He had about 280 whose fathers he taught. That just, I mean, exactly tells you that that heritage privilege is still there.
Yeah, we've got a comment, I think it was from Michelle, who said some of these questions are still there on the school forms. And Michelle, as a parent of a soon to be 7-year-old and 4-year-old, yes, absolutely, I can confirm that they do still ask those kinds of questions. Okay, so Prof, here's the thing. When the Model C schools came, you know, schools had all sorts of options to be Model A, Model B, Model C. We know all about that whole history. I want to zoom in on something you write about the quintile 1 to 5. Now the 5s are the ones getting the least subsidies or the least state help, and the ones is the top 20, the 20% poorest schools that get the most money. So in a normal world, if the quintile 1 is getting, say, 1,250 per pupil from the government, and quintile 5, they're getting whatever, 145, I can't remember the figure. Well, that should level the playing field, except that it doesn't. Quintile 5 getting little money from the government, they've got means to increase school fees. And logically, you'd think, okay, they're increasing school fees because they're getting little money from the government. But as they increase school fees, it never balances. That whole inequality just carries on and carries on. Do we need to legislate? I'm not a fan of legislating and regulating every single area of our lives, but if it's causing such discrepancies and inequality, how do we respond to it?
Yeah, that's a really, really important question at the heart, I think, of the problem. Now, one of the big debates in the early 1990s was whether the new government, the ANC-led government, should place a cap on the fees that parents could levy in the former white schools. And that was a huge debate, I remember. And eventually government said no, because of the fear that parents would simply step out of the public system, leave it incredibly weak, and then set up a parallel private school system. So you're right. Whatever the government gives to the poorer schools, the effect of that is wiped out by school fees that run, up to 120 or 140,000 at the upper end of the elite schools. So what government gives makes absolutely no difference if what you're wanting to solve is inequality. So how does one get out of this rut? I've thought about this long and hard. I don't really think that the answer is to, tell the more privileged schools what to do with their money. I don't think that will cause a political riot, I think, in our country, and you don't want a parallel private school system. What I really think what we need to do is to completely up the level of funding to the poorest schools, but to make sure that those funds translate into more equitable outcomes. Because you can give money till you blue in the face, but if you cannot guarantee that there's a teacher, a textbook, and time well used in every single one of those schools where you've upped the funding, then of course the efficiency, as the economists of education would call it, the efficiency is very, very low, and so on. So that's, I think, where we need to put the effort: up the funding and make sure that the funding leads to equitable outcomes.
Okay, we're going to take questions in the next segment, but I do want to address this one because it goes to the heart of what we are talking about. Somebody just asked the question, is this book about private schools? And I think that word elite is what perhaps can cause that kind of perception. Perhaps you can speak to that and say specifically why you chose the schools that you chose. Any one of you.
Okay, so we looked at schools that were previously Model C schools, so they were previously white schools, and it's not private schools, it's public schools and private schools, and the 30 schools that we chose are basically in the southern suburbs corridor. So we've taken schools from the deep south, from Fishhook, all the way through to the City Bowl. And I mean, in that entire area, there's about 40 previously white schools. And we've interviewed principals of 30 of those schools. Does that answer the question?
Yes, it does.
And it's quite a mix of public and private, of parochial and and secular schools, of Afrikaans and English schools. So we wanted that mix as well in the identities of the schools.
Okay, they're thanking me for the answer. So here's the thing. It seems obvious, but I think it does still deserve interrogation and and reflection. The link, the relationship between schools' resources and the results. Also, in answering, in speaking to that theme, also the perception that the presence of a Black teacher or a Black a principal or even more Black kids would automatically result in a drop in standards. And here, it's not an accusation directed at white fellow South Africans, but Black parents, as I shared my experience of a Black nurse who was speaking to another nurse, saying that too many Black kids. So you answered it, Prof, when you said that there is complicity, Black upper class, middle class, in maintaining the class separation, the class separation and identity of these particular schools. So let's talk about resources and results. What did you find?
Yeah, this wasn't specifically a study about academic performance. As you know, it was mainly about admissions, but certainly in other research that we've done, we have seen throughout the country, in some of the poorest townships, I'm just thinking now of places like Umlazi, places in Thohoyandou, in Limpopo, which I'm sure you've heard of some of these schools that give you the best math and science results in 100% Black school without any, and the secret there is leadership. The secret there is the culture of the school. The secret there is the teachers who show up and so on. So the perception that we often have that if there are more Black teachers or more Black learners, then the standards fall is not only offensive on its face, it is simply not true. What explains the difference between high and low performance. I've seen some terrible schools, former white schools, a lot of white kids in it. I see at university where I teach white kids and Black kids, the difference has got nothing to do with your epidermis. It really has to do with your ability to think. But in the school sector specifically, it has to do with local leadership, community participation in the school, a principal who drives the project, and teachers who show up. So if we can get that right, as I said, it's not the resources per se, it's how we use the resources we have and the resources that I think we need to really to upscale in the poorest schools, how we get those towards results. And there's another book, I'm sorry, this is about our new book, but there's another book that we wrote called How to Fix South Africa's Schools that shows you exactly how to make that translation of resources into results.
Sorry, Reddy, can I just add,
Sure.
you were speaking about resources, and very often the parents have this perception that these previously Model C or these previously white schools have all the resources. They do. They have a lot of resources. But you know what? Down on the ground, it comes to teaching. I've seen good, brilliant teachers at schools that have absolutely nothing. And I've also seen some like pathetic teachers at schools that have everything. The problem what these schools that have everything can do is that the parents have the ability to maybe pay for extra lessons or to have learning support or to have, and so that's what makes the perception that the school is brilliant and the teaching is brilliant. Very often that cannot be the case. So there are good and bad teachers.
Yes. Okay, so here's the reality. Apartheid spatial planning. That's why I said this book is not, it is about schools, but it is about everything else, our society, our history, how there are continuities between, a colonial past, apartheid past, and democratic South Africa. Not much has changed from that point of view. People still live far from places of work. The good schools are still in those areas, far from where people actually live. Now, going back to that theme of the exclusionary tools and practices, it makes perfect sense for me for a cashier at Pick n Pay down the road for me who lives in Orange Farm to enroll their child here at Hyde Park High. It makes perfect sense for me. But I don't see that. I see the workers, the moms and the dads going to work all by themselves at 6 a.m. in the morning, hoping that their kids are left at home, getting ready for school, and so on. So there's a way in which, and Samantha, I go back to your very strongly made point that we can't make excuses 26 years later. And that is, we've lived in South Africa long enough to know that people live far from where they work. Why not make life easy for parents and allow them to enroll their kids in schools that are close to their workplaces? Talk to me about that.
Can I just say, Prof, I mean, there was only one school that we spoke to the principal and they had a zone 1 and a zone 2 policy. And by that, it meant the zone 1 was when you live in the area and the zone 2 was whether you work in the area. Every other school did not even think about using, where the parents work. That's a question we should ask the school. I do think that, besides zone 1 and school fees and sibling privilege, by the time they tried to look at zone 2, I think that they were basically full. And so they just shelved that idea. Prof, Jonathan, what's your
take? I actually think really this is precisely why we wanted to look at schools that buck the trend. And as you know, we have two principals who Sam and I were so impressed by them. Yes. Because they broke down all those logics for defending the status quo by how they manage their admissions policy.
Yeah, I mean, okay, that brings us then to our conversation with our two principals who might like to join our conversation right now. Brandon Pulse and Anne Morton. I must say, I had, my eyes watered when I was reading those conversations with the principals. And I say this every time. I feel very deeply about this because I know that my teachers, from the township school to the convent to Potch Girls, I would not be who I am were it not for my teachers and school principals included. And it's not even about the way they taught, it's them seeing me, their humanity, them caring about who I was, what I thought, encouraging me to express myself. I found the most intense love in the arms of my teachers and my principals. So I welcome you to this conversation. Anne and Brendan, are you with us? I can't see you. Are you there?
Yeah, thanks, Lily.
Okay. So Brendan, I'm going to start with you because I think your experience does represent the, why white families leave and Black ones come, and what does the conversation around the standards, about the socioeconomic factors, proximity to public roads and schools and transport and all of that. Just talk to us about this journey of transition, how you experienced it in your school.
Sure. Thank you, Lily. So yeah, it's been quite an interesting journey, because I mean, when I arrived at my present school 5 years ago, that transformation had already started happening in many ways, where the school, being a former, if you want to call it the white school, suddenly became more of a predominantly black school. And you grapple with the idea of why is it so? And what I did was, before I arrived here, I chatted to past parents, I chatted to the community. I just wanted to understand the school in many ways, and why things happen in the school. But definitely it seemed to have been the post-94, when schools opened up, when schools started transforming in many ways. Many of the white parents first saw it as a novelty. It's great that the kids are mixing, but when the tide turned, sort of 2/3, for example, more white, and I mean, it resonates with your story in many ways, where people then started moving out. So in many ways, sometimes, yes, it's got to do with race, but I also sometimes think it's got to do with the class system in many ways, because I can afford, and I think you will know that if I think I pay more, I think I get a better product. And often that's not necessarily the case. So as a grouping, as a governing body, we had to look at, how do we look at it as a school? Because our admission policy did say only the immediate area. So the immediate area would be a very privileged area around our school. So we looked at developing what we call the radius in many ways, and we sort of branched it out, which then meant at least more people could have access to, and dare I say, the quality school, a well-resourced school, and they would have more access into that. And so that's sort of how we try to work with that, to embrace the changing times, if you want to call it that. But yeah, but definitely it's a struggle, because people do think that standards drop. And I think you raised that earlier, and I think Sam mentioned it as well. And I mean, I shared, and I often say this even to my own staff, that I feel often that I've got to work harder as a principal in a school like this, because I feel I'm constantly judged because I'm not fair-skinned, if you want to call it that. So yeah, so it's definitely an interesting journey. But again, if you have the right culture, if you show people what you're about, you get the results at the end of the day. You have competent, skilled teachers, you have a good ethos, you have a place where people want to belong, then that's what they will buy into at the end of the day as well.
Yeah. And also, you mentioned something about getting to know the community as well. And I'm just thinking that, going to Potch and going to Parktown Convent, I wasn't part of the community. My community was in Orlando East, and yet I was so separate from the community because I was going to a different school. What have you found about that very essential and sacred link and ownership between, or seeing parents and families as stakeholders in the life of a school? How well do you think we are doing in that regard?
Sure. I think that is quite a challenging one, because I think any school, whether it is in a well-resourced area or even in a not well-resourced area, I think the foundation of any good school is definitely the community and how the community buys into the school. Whether the community is right on your doorstep or whether the community is 20 kilometers away, if the community is buying into what you are setting as a school and as a product, and then buying into what you give and you offer, I think there's a greater sense of pride, a greater sense of belonging. I mean, I often use a word that, I say, we own what we build together. So if people feel that they belong, they are part of, then I think that you'll get, whatever the racial composition of the school may be, if they feel there's a sense of belonging, and if you have the happy kids who feel they belong in the school as well, many other things happen at the same time. Yeah. So I think that is in essence. I don't think it's just in a well-resourced school. I think it could happen in any school where people feel a sense of belonging and a sense of ownership as well.
Well done to you. I mean, these are not easy targets, easy goals, and for every day that you put your best foot forward and create this inclusive society that we are all desperate for, educating the future generation as well. So well done to you. We've got a question from one of our viewers for you, Brendan. I'll ask it later, but I do want to meet this principal who makes tea, rooibos tea, for one of her pupils. I mean, I just read that about 10 times and like, what? A 7-year-old asked you for tea? And then I like that part where he says, with milk, please. I thought that was just so sweet. But Anne, I mean, what's that about? Where do you get this vast energy to be a leader of a school, a teacher, a nurturing educator, all in that pressured environment? I mean, I've got a 7-year-old and very often I run from them. They're very demanding, but you still make them tea. And
thanks, Reedy. I think I've been in this particular school for 24 years, and that has made a huge difference. So my community trusts me, I trust them. I have fabulous staff members that you can see behind me, in fact.
yes.
The governing body has put the right people in place to do the jobs that a principal does in many other schools. So I have an operations manager, I have a HR administrator. We don't pay loads of money, but we do have people who are specifically doing a particular role that in many schools that are under-resourced, the principal teaches a class, the principal collects the school fees, the principal checks on the security, the principal checks on the fields to make sure they're mowed, and so on and so on. I have a role that's the nurturer of the space. And that's the big difference. So I can create the space that I always wanted as a school. So every single time we find a new child that needs something different for themselves in the nurturing, then that means that we have to then create the space differently again. And so lots of those children that were featured in the book are actually children who many schools would never accept. But we chose them consciously, like we choose our children, because we in fact want difference. Difference of many different kinds. It's not about race or about ability or disability in any way. It's actually just about creating a safe space for every child that lives in South Africa.
I mean, I'm just looking at your staff members behind you, and I've never seen such a diverse group of teachers. Never. From the township school where it was all Black teachers and 2 or 3 nuns, white nuns, to Parktown Convent, all my teachers were white, including the Zulu teacher who often mispronounced a lot of the Zulu words. And coming from a township, I can speak Zulu. He didn't like me very much because I would often correct him. So even in the provision of the Zulu language, they couldn't find a Black teacher. And of course, even now with my children, 1 or 2 Black teachers. I mean, Prof is right. Your school is backing the trend. How did you achieve this? How did you do it? And let's be honest, we've addressed how white peoples and white families would move out, how Black upwardly mobile families would also prefer to keep the schools at a particular class and a particular race, I suppose. I'm sure you met some resistance when you were managing the school in the way in which you're managing. Can you share that and how you overcame that?
Well, firstly, just to say that the people behind you are not all teachers. We believe that every single person on the staff is a teaching person and a nurturer and whatever. So all our staff are called Mrs. and Mr. whoever, or Sir or Ma'am, depending on what the children want to call you. But our cleaning staff, for instance, are called Uncle Saki and Auntie Mamti. And so they're all there too. And so for the children, it's all about everyone on the premises that is a supporter for them. So that's to explain to you, those are not all teachers. That's our whole staff.
All right.
And then the other issue is that I think I was in a privileged position when I took over the Red School, because in the early 90s, between 1990 and 1993, I was at another Pineland school and I was the deputy there. And being the deputy at that school, we faced exactly what Brandon was talking about, because with the more Black children, because it was close to a station, the more Black children came into the school, the more the white families actually at that school went to the Red School. Mm-hmm. And so it was a very interesting thing for me now to take over the Red School when a lot of those families I knew from the previous school. And so so that started a very interesting conversation, because it was all about, so why are you here now and you left the other school? What will make you stay here and why are you still here? Because at one point in Pinelands, this is the community's words, there was a Black school, a brown school, and a white school. Mm-hmm. And we were the brown school. So if the families had moved from the school that I'd been at before, and now they were at the brown school, why were they still at the brown school? Why were they not moving out also to the other school in Pinelands? Mm-hmm. And so we had lots of very serious conversations. My wish for the school, as you read in the book, is that I luckily started a school with my own leaders. And so we could choose the leaders of our school. And because of that, I could direct the future of the school into, at that point it was the new South Africa, because it was around 1994 time. And so it was all about how can we make a community that reflects what would be the best of South Africa. And so it was all about creating that and engaging with white parents particularly. In fact, my school has very few Black parents because, as you were saying earlier, a lot of elite Black parents actually prefer a white school rather than a mixed school. And so we had to have conversations with all those families as well to say, what is it that's going to keep you here? What must we change so that we can sustain this? Because we could be a recipe for schooling in South Africa.
And I mean, clearly from Samantha and Prof, they really do believe that you are a recipe and a success story. And I know that in the book, there's a lot that's being said about your leadership as well. And Samantha, perhaps let me start with you. I mean, what is it that stood out about the Red School, and how do we scale it up and use it as a model for where we could be as a country?
Well, firstly, let me say that you know what, if you are a principal and if you are a leader, you can't please everybody. So it's difficult to kind of balance who's in the school and who's not. What stands out about the Red School is that exactly what the quote says, the openness to different. Whereas of your other previously white schools would be, you need to conform to the school because this is how we operate. And so I love that. I love about the Red School, what's important is that they value the uniqueness of the child. You might not have arms, you might not think as clearly as what someone else does, but that doesn't mean that you will not be accepted at the school. Now, I actually saw a comment where a parent had said, but my son with a disability was not accepted. And, you know, that is unfortunate. However, if you think about it, the Red School is if I can say, a normal school. So there are children from all over that come, and obviously they are open to these differences. And there are some parents that will be accepted, and there are some parents that will not be accepted. But what I like also about the Red School is that the school that was in 1993, it's going to be a totally different school to what you see now. The issue I have with a lot of other schools is that you see the same school and they kind of buck behind this, or this is the tradition, this is what we do. Whereas, you know what, if you look at it, the country's changing, the children are changing, so the school should change, the leadership should start thinking differently about it. And that's what I love about the Red School, is that openness to change. Let's try something. If it doesn't work, tough, we'll try something else. And lots of schools, lots of principals, and lots of leaders are actually too scared to actually make that change, or just put things in place so that change can actually take place. I think for me, that's about the Red School, that's what stands out the most.
And Prof, just your thoughts then about the Red School and Brandon schools as well, or a school as well, or any of the schools that you wrote about that that stood out for you, and why they stood out.
Yeah, so I think one of the advantages that Anne has is, and that also applies to some other schools, is it really depends who your parents are. So when you look at a community like Pinelands, which is within a short drive from UCT, for example, you tend to get parents who are a little bit more open-minded, a little bit more progressive, a little bit more, in fact, you hear some of those parents say in the interviews we had with them, we want the school to be more diverse. In fact, we want, as Anne has also said, we need more Black African kids in the school and so on. Now, if you have parents with that mindset, you get a diverse school. Brandon, I think, if I may be bold, I think he's got the opposite problem. He has to persuade more parents, okay, who don't necessarily, I mean, they'll all be all very nice and smiling with you, but they don't have that broader sense of inclusion as a commitment, and so when you see the upheaval at schools like Springfield recently, or you see, or at Herschel and so on, it's because there are, and at Grove, it's because there are parents, white parents incidentally, working with Black parents saying, enough is enough. We need to revisit our admissions policy. So there's a combination of who are the parents in that immediate area, and Pinelands, as many of us know, is a sort of professional community of people, very often academics and so on and so forth, who tend to be a little bit more liberal on these kinds of things. That's not true for many other parts of the southern suburbs. And let me just say this already, what has been very painful for me was to watch principals like Brandon, who would say to you, I have done everything and better than what was the case when the school was white. And still I can't convince these parents. They don't put it as emotionally as I do, because they are very reserved as principals. But it's painful to hear them saying, as the principal at another school close to Brandon said, I can compete with them on academics, but I can't compete with whiteness.
Whiteness, I remember that. And Brandon, this question is for you, if you're comfortable answering. It says, what are the challenges of coming into a school where all previous principals were white? Okay, you've answered the question, but carry on, please.
No, really, I think I've been fortunate, I suppose, in many ways, because at my previous school, I'd also become the principal, having been the deputy, and I'd taken over from somebody who was also, the first Black principal. And I think the first comment, I'll never forget it. And I think it's something that has stuck with me ever since I've become a principal, was a comment was made that the school is now going to go to the tubes and down the drain or whatever, and standards are going to drop because look what they were pointing. It was made by a parent at the school. And it almost, I don't know, maybe that drove me to make sure that I never dropped standards, that I worked harder. And when I left the school to come to my present school, a comment, or many comments were made about why are you leaving? Because you've left the school so much better than what, for example, you found. And I think that's for all of us, is to take it from whatever we find. There's a beautiful saying that always says, whatever you find when you leave it in a better place in many ways. And So yes, it is a struggle because you're constantly having to prove yourself. I mean, my SMT, who probably are listening right now, often they say to me, but why are you so driven? And I say, because I don't want to be seen as the person who drops the ball in this community. So, and even my circuit manager, when I was appointed, my first meeting with him, he sat on the couch across me in my office, and he said, you must remember now, Mr. Bolsa, the community, the people, they're all watching to see what's going to happen to the school. And again, it was that whole thing of you realize that you've got to work. No, not because I don't think, I mean, I think I work as hard and I think I have that ethos, and but you just feel that you have to because you're being watched constantly and you're being compared to your counterparts who may have it a little bit easier in some way.
Yeah, in fact, you're just reminding me of Barack Obama in his in the biography or the autobiography, or it was even Michelle repeats it in her memoir about how they went out of their way not to cause trouble, bad trouble, to be almost perfect because they knew that the scrutiny was unrelenting and it was much harder on them. But Anne, there's a question here for you. And we know that even the transformed schools, the ones that are backing the trend, the great schools, not every child will get accepted. So this question says, what advice would you give parents who are unsuccessful in getting their children into your school?
Well, that's a little hard because the truth of the matter is that I've actually suggested to quite a few education department heads of education and ministers in the Western Cape that if they give me another plot of land, and there is one close by, and they build me a school, I'll happily take the school to double the size. And so I've offered that to quite a few ministers of education in the Western Cape, and none of them are actually taking me up on the suggestion. Because the truth of the matter is that I love it when my staff leave and go to another school, because I know that then there's another little island of red schools starting somewhere else. And then that would be my wish, that every single one of us could go off and create a whole lot of red schools all around the country, because isn't that what South Africa needs? So to answer that one parent who wants their child in my school, I think Jonathan and Samantha have just created a bigger problem for me by writing this book. When I read chapter 8, I thought to myself, what the hell am I going to do now?
Yeah.
And so the truth of the matter is that my school is not the perfect place to be. Every principal should try the very hardest they can to make their school as inclusive as it could be. And some people are open to that and some are not. And so my wish is that in South African education, there would be far more inclusive schools than there would be of exclusive schools.
Mm-hmm. Prof, I'm just reminded of that, the incident, is it Rivonia Primary School? Yeah. I remember we covered it quite extensively in the news. If I remember correctly there, it was about someone trying to get in and the school saying, we've reached the numbers. And in that kind of situation, you know, I remember there were reports that the school was being racist. They were excluding the child because they're Black, but the school came up and said, hey, look, we've reached the numbers. It went to court and so on. So what do we do with a scenario like that? What do we do with a situation like that? Is the teacher-pupil ratio something that also needs to be looked at? I mean, what is international best practice? In Orlando East, there were about 32 of us in the classroom. At Parktown Convent, there were 18 of us. And Potch Girls, there were 24 of us. So what's the reality? What do we do in this vast country of ours?
Yeah, the reality is that even if every single one of the former white schools become Black, there still will not be enough places for Black children, for all our children, to obtain high quality education. So two things need to happen at the same time. on the one hand, you need to make sure that the schools of privilege are more diverse, not just in terms of race, but in terms of class, in terms of religion, in terms of disability, etc. That for me is a real South African school. If we need to talk inclusive education, that is inclusive education. At the same time, you have to make sure that the schools where the majority of our children go are schools that also have high quality teachers, also have a predictable timetable, also have, access to data and devices in a pandemic and that kind of thing. So the long-term solution is not being too fixated on 20% of our schools. We need to put the spotlight on privilege, undoubtedly. But in the long term, we've got to make all our schools work for all our children, and that is something we won't be able to escape.
I'm just going to read some comments. Some are not questions, just a comment. Bantu Bonke says, school uniform is also used as a tool of exclusion. Joe Bantu Bonke, don't get me started about the cost of those blazers for 6-year-olds. And today it doesn't come back, and then you're driving to school to fetch it, and then the child is blank. You tell her, don't leave your blazer on the playground again. The next day they do the same. Oh my word. And then there's a sock for this occasion and a shirt for that occasion and a skirt for that occasion. It's just way too much, I'm telling you. And then I think people do want some advice from you, Prof and Samantha, about how to get into these elite schools. What advice would you give parents applying to these elite schools in the southern suburbs? I think I'm remembering one particular thing you say in the book. Knowledge of school is also is quite important. But just very briefly, the bullet points. Samantha. Sorry.
Okay. So you've touched on knowledge of the school, which is very important, because a parent has a perception of a school, but is that school actually the best school for your child? There are certain schools, like especially if you talk about the boys' schools, they have sports. So if you know that, my child is an excellent sportsman, you would then use all the sporting facilities and sporting opportunities at the school. In the same way, you'll use all the cultural activities at the school as well. The other thing I just wanted to point out is that remember that we are talking about primary schools and primary school kids as such. I mean, who knows if they are going to be like the next Wade van Niekerk or whatever. So at that stage, the perception of the school is extremely important. The one thing, though, that I feel that a lot of parents overlook is one of the devices that we use in the book and that we talk about in the book, and that is the whole concept of early lock-in. And early lock-in is basically what schools use to lock in the learners so that they know that the learners will progress through the school. So what happens at a lot of the schools is that they have a grade R, they have a grade double R or double O, and they have, a triple grade R or a triple grade O. And so what we've seen is that, especially in those early years, 80% of schools that have that, the learners are, the children at the school are white. And one of the reasons for that is obviously because I suppose the fees are high and they are able to pay those, because remember, the education department doesn't put any, they don't really play a role when it comes to those early years. So a lot of parents, the one time you think about schools is, oh, my child's going to grade R or my child's going to grade, me think of what school. By that time, the rest, a lot of the children are locked into the system already, which means that it's difficult for parents that are applying at grade 1, which you would think is the normal time to apply, it's difficult for them to get into the system. So for me, like I said, what's important, know what the school is about when they start accepting children, learners, and what other little schools, what other pre-primary schools in the area are kind of feeder schools to those. Now, a lot of schools will not tell you, oh, well, go to this pre-primary because they feed in. But if you do your homework and ask the security or the tea lady or someone else, they'll be able to tell you exactly, no, go to that school, because a lot of the children that are at that pre-primary school would then feed into whatever school you are looking at. So a big thing is a lot of parents, they look too late. And rightly so, all the places are taken up because there's only a certain amount of spaces for grade 1 and everyone's trying to get their kids in at grade 1.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, I think that's also important, really, and this is sort of, I suppose, counterintuitive. We also have to start saying to parents, it's not the end of the world if your child didn't get into a formal white school. I am always amazed that, let me take if I lived in Cape Town today and I didn't have a lot of money and my kids were at school, you know, the school I would send them to is South Peninsula High School. I've seen absolutely no difference between South Peninsula and Norman Henshelwood for the Cape Townians. You'll know what I'm talking about. But it's this perception, even among Black parents, you know, that if you don't get into normies, as they call it, in summer your kid is going to lose out for the day. I went to not terrible schools. I mean, the resources that were terrible. I had also like really good teachers, committed teachers. I didn't go to Model C school, you know, you couldn't in those days, but it wasn't the end of the world, you know. And so it's also important, you go to Durban. I can tell you now, if I lived in Durban, one of the schools I would consider is not Westfield Boys or Westfield Girls. I would consider Menzies High School in Umlazi, which is a fantastic school. I used to go there just to recruit their students to the University of the Free State, and my goodness me, what incredible graduates they became. So I think we also need to just look, if you didn't get into Springfield, you didn't get into Herschel, using Cape Town examples here, it is not the end of the world, you know. Learning doesn't stop, achievement doesn't stop. And I would certainly look out for the best, you know, Black schools in my area. And as I said, SP is a very good example of a school where the kids go places after graduation.
I'm just thinking here, you know, I went back to Portugal to give a speech a couple of years ago. And I remember my former biology teacher kind of showing off at the number of Black girls who were getting awards at the prize giving. And he was very proud of them. And he looked at me and said, it's very different from when you guys were here. Not that we weren't smart, but we were such a minority at that time. It's still majority white, I suppose, being in Potchefstroom, but we were like the first batch. But at this prize giving, so there was a whole lot of diversity. And if I were to give the school feedback, which I did years later, about what transformation and an integrated school looks like, it would go beyond just the numbers of Black kids. I would have loved for them to learn a bit more about our culture, our language. We started forming a Black girls choir and one of the parents complained, and I understand now, they felt we need to be integrated. We've got a school choir, Black and white. So why are we having an exclusively Black choir? Look, now I think it actually was a good thing. We were bringing a different type of music, but she was making also a very valid point that make those contributions in the school choir. Anyway, the Black Girls Choir died a natural death, but there's so much that we could have just contributed had we been invited to. Perhaps we should have taken the initiative, but hey, we're 13, 14, 15 years old. So, you know, the schools themselves, as they navigate this conversation, how do we challenge them to understand what it's about, that it's not just about the number of Black teachers, of Black schools, the cultures, the practices, the traditions of the school, the activities, all of that, they were all new to me and I couldn't identify with any of them, but we did them anyway because that is the way of the schools. Just thought I should give that rant. Samantha, I don't know what you think.
Well, I think that what is important though in a culture being important in a school is that lots of the schools that we went to, we found that the leadership, the teachers on the SMT, and even just general teachers was still mostly white. So at these schools, you find that if we look at the 30 schools, you find that teachers kind of feel, I've got a good thing going. So the only time they leave is when they have to retire, or sometimes if they move, or sometimes if they die, actually. And so you don't get teachers of color in your leadership positions so that they can actually say, well, you know what, this tradition that you have is not conducive to everybody, and these are new cultural differences that we need to put in. And principals need to go out and actively look for teachers. There are very good, brilliant teachers of color, Black teachers out there, but principals need to actively go in and look, because a lot of principals have said, well, you know what, they don't apply to our schools. Well, they're not going to apply if you actually just advertise online and expect them to, click on the link or whatever, because that's not where they are looking. In the communities, you're not online all the time. So I think that, for cultures to change, we need to have people in leadership that are Black, that are white, that are colored, that are Muslim, that are Jewish, that are all different, come from all different backgrounds, so that you can actually kind of, put that culture in the school. I think that's important. And, children see more, they learn from what they see. You tell them you've got to be kind to someone else if you are not. So in the same way, if they only see that, okay, well, the only Black people at our school are the maintenance guys, or, the guy that's the security or whatever, what perception are you actually putting out there? So it's important that principals of all schools look at getting teachers and people at this school that actually come from different, all different backgrounds.
Prof, I just want to go back to what the book says around policy. The fact that when you go on a website, there is an admissions policy. And now I've learned that I probably shouldn't bother with the admissions policy, because what's out there is not actually what is being practiced. And the point in the book, I think, it's that the presence of policy doesn't actually bring change. Its function may just be symbolic and just ticking the box. How do we move from that? And I suspect here, the parents who are already in the school have a lot of work to do to create access for those who are trying to get in.
Yeah, I interviewed the former president, F.W. de Klerk, and because I wanted to understand from him, what exactly did you guys conquer, in the early 90s in the negotiations? And one of the things that was very clear to me from that long interview is that that education, in fact, what almost held up the constitutional negotiations? It wasn't politics and stuff, it was education, because they wanted to secure for themselves the privileges of education into the new, the new South Africa, and so on and so forth. So from a policy perspective, I don't think much is going to change, etc. Mainly because, as you saw in the book, that the Black middle classes need to have 20% of schools of privilege to send their kids to. You did a roll call in Parliament, and you asked everybody sitting there, all those MPs, where do you send your kids to school? I guarantee you not a single one of them send their kids to township schools or etc. So the change, unfortunately, is going to really depend on the schools doing it, and progressive schools that realize the game is up. You remember that social media war that we had a few weeks ago? That was a wake-up call. The hair incidents, at St. Susie and Pretoria, that's a wake-up call, and so on. So I'm hoping, and by the way, let me just say this in honor of my late friend Neville Alexander, the activist. Neville always tried to convince me. I was never quite convinced, but I think I'm coming around eventually. One way to change this in the former white schools, in fact in all our schools, is to sort of say, why the hell are you still teaching English and Afrikaans? If you're going to teach one of those languages, why can't the other language be the regional African language? Now that will put the cat among the pigeons, because suddenly when you're speaking a broader range of languages and other children's languages, you have a sort of equity, a sort of equality, that, and then make sure this. I mean, I still don't understand why the isiZulu teacher is a white person. Heaven help us, you know. I mean, unless you yourself grew up in the culture and language of the region. Those are things schools can do, because guess what? The South African Schools Act puts the power in the hands of the governing body to decide not only on admissions, but also on language policy. And if you broaden your language policy, there's things you can do. And can I just mention, you know how I fell in love with Red School and Berkeley Primary, but yes. Red School in particular. The moment I came in there, you know, these children ran to me and started to talk to me and so on. And Anne stopped them and said, "What are you proud of?" I'll never forget this as long as I live. And I thought the kids would talk about the netball team, or the kids would talk about, you know, the ducks and stuff running around the place. Do you know what those children said? These are 21st century children. They said, "You know what we are proud of is our gender neutral toilets." I said, there isn't another school in the world
gender
A, that has gender neutral toilets, and B, that primary school children are proud of that. That's what I mean by small things you can do to make your school more inclusive, but the government can't do that for you.
We've got so many comments just thanking you, Anne, thanking you, Brandon, for the work that you're doing. Happy parents. And somebody told me earlier, I lost the message now, that you've got a puzzle, Anne, outside your office for the learners, for the pupils. Okay, so that's being acknowledged there. I do want to. I don't want to end before asking you about this quote. Let me find it. Oh, there. I found it very interesting that there was a school principal who said these southern suburbs are probably the most untransformable area of Southern Africa. That struck me, because the school principal didn't say untransformed. It was untransformable. So, geez, that's overwhelming. That's really overwhelming. Tell me about that, but also some light at the end of the tunnel. Can we shift this? Can we change our schools to be more inclusive, to make sure that whoever wants to get in does get in, and the reasons for that are equitable and they're just? Samantha, I'll start with you. I'm just going to switch on the light so that you can all see me, but carry on, please, to answer the question.
Okay, just sorry, Ran. I actually replied to someone on the chat, so I missed that. What was that question, Reddy?
Oh, okay. No, it was this quote from a school principal who said these southern suburbs are probably the most untransformable. I was struck by the untransformable, not untransformed. So the question is, can it be done? Can it be done at all?
Oh, yes, it can. It takes careful planning. It takes hard work, and it takes constant work all the time. But I certainly think that it can be transformed. And you know what? If certain things don't work, it means that you obviously need to look at something else. Thing is that a lot of these schools, we've got to see that there's very often one or two parents who eventually do get on the school governing body and try and make the change and try do things. I mean, Jonathan has done so many talks at so many schools, and literally a year, 2, 3 years later, nothing much has changed. So very often we kind of think that the leadership down on the ground, they don't really want to do the change. They don't really want to do the hard work. But I do think that it is very possible.
And Jonathan?
I think that that is true. What is also true is that principals can only do as much as their bosses allow them to do. In other words, if your school governing body has a preponderance of conservative members, it's very hard for an open-minded principal to really change the school on these kinds of issues. So I'm working with 2 other people at the moment to figure out how we can help governing bodies to lead the transformation in their schools, to not set up all these visible and invisible barriers to access. And therefore not to wait till there's a major public crisis, as you've seen at Springfield School, because then everybody loses. The school loses. You know, there's huge reputational damage. And our best schools must continue to be best in a broader way, if you know what I mean.
Yes.
And so these schools, I mean, I remember very clearly sitting with Sam in that interview when this principal of one segment of the school said the place is untransformable. And this was a school in which I think 83% of the kids are white or something like that. So I'm not prepared to give up or to have a voluntaristic sort of view of change. I see the locus of change being the school governing body. And we're going to do workshops up and down, not just the corridor, but also the country, to make sure that we shift those understandings, etc. But it's simple things, you know, as I said of my son's previous school, Pretoria Boys High School, are you really trying to tell me that for the past 100 years, the only principals you could choose were white males? What the hell? Do you think we're stupid? And it's that kind of madness, you know, that causes crises at our schools. And as I said, everybody loses.
We have a pupil of yours, Samantha, Bianca van Veek, who's proud of you, says you taught her, you were her teacher, and she loves you madly, and so on. So you're all feeling loved today. So yeah, it's 6 o'clock. We're wrapping up. I do want to thank University of Stellenbosch Business School for managing the event. Owen, we heard from you earlier, Nadia Padeyachi, and the whole USB team. And of course, publishers. Writers are nothing without publishers. Juta, Paula Whitaker, Chris Lawrence Kensley, and the Juta team. You know, I always end shows and panel discussions elated, having learned something, reflecting on something, but I do want to thank the audience, because you keep the conversations going. And sometimes we don't get to your questions, we don't get to your comment, but it is contributing to the body of work. This was being recorded. We are going to go back and read your inputs, your experiences, your thoughts. And so I want to really thank you for taking the time to be with us. Let me just say, as somebody who has read the book, this is actually a very positive book. It doesn't gloss over the problems. It's very positive, because the solutions are suggested, they are implementable, the case studies are so relatable. You page through and you think, oh, I've been in that situation. Oh, I saw this. I never thought of it this way. So it will invite you to see normal things in a new way, but also question what you regard as normal. I know that I'm going to be a different parent when I take my kids to school on the day that that they open. I'm going to care far more about the school itself, the ethos, how those outside are experiencing the school, how other parents are experiencing the school, and not just look at whether or not my daughters are happy and just leave it at that. I will question things a bit more. I thought I was that kind of person who questioned things, but there are things in this book that now that I know, Oprah says, when we know better, we do better. Now I see them as exclusionary tools, and I will be not fighting, not combating, but challenging them as well. So South Africa, go out and get who gets in and why. Race, class, and aspiration in South Africa's elite schools. And elite, of course, it's not just private schools. It is about the entirety of the mix, and primary schools in particular. So thank you very much. Congratulations, Samantha. Congratulations, Jonathan. Thank you so very much for inviting me to moderate.
And Reddy, can I just, on behalf of our audience and on behalf of Sam and I's authors, on behalf of all the principals, on behalf of South Africa, I think everybody who's listened to you today knows that it has been an incredible privilege to have you to host the show. Somebody, you know, you rub shoulders with the Oprah Winfreys and the Obamas, and then
Who's talking?
and then you come to the southern suburbs. So, Reddy, from the bottom of my heart, thank you very, very much for your example, for your leadership, and for being passionate about everybody's books. I mean, I just don't know how you do it. It is an incredible privilege. So I can tell you right now, I used to market for the University of the Free State. I went straight to Potch Girls, but I have a completely different view now. I'm going to go back there to see what on earth are they doing right.
That's my school,
the Red School,
Don't touch me on my
School
studio.
of the Northwest, absolutely. Thank you, Reddy.
Thank you, and thank you, Anne and Brandon. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.